It is a $2 billion a day handshake. For generations, this bridge has been more than just steel and concrete. It was a symbol of the most integrated economic partnership on Earth, a seamless artery of prosperity. Then, in a reckless gamble, one man tried to weaponize it. But his plan backfired spectacularly, triggering a doomsday response from his closest ally that now threatens to plunge American industry into chaos and leave the White House dangerously isolated. How did a trade bluff escalate into a full-blown economic war? To comprehend the sheer scale of the current crisis, you have to understand the depth of the integration. For over half a century, the U.S. and Canadian economies effectively operated as one. Under agreements like NAFTA and its successor, USMCA, they didn't just trade, they built things together. A car part might cross the border 6 times before the finished vehicle rolls off a Michigan assembly line. It was a single, hyper-efficient continental factory floor, the envy of the world. This symbiotic relationship, built on trust and predictability, became the bedrock of North American prosperity and a cornerstone of the global economy. But the foundation began to crack long before 2025. During his first term, President Trump's decision to impose tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing the unbelievable justification of national security under Section 232 of the Trade Act, was a profound psychological shock to Ottawa. While that dispute was eventually resolved, it left a deep scar. It taught Canada a painful lesson. The decades of unwavering partnership could be erased by political whim. The quiet trust that underpinned the relationship was broken. Canadian policymakers realized that their deep reliance on a single, unpredictable market was a critical national vulnerability. They began to quietly plan, to strategize for the next inevitable confrontation. They developed a new playbook, one that moved beyond simple retaliation. When the next, even more audacious attack came, Canada would not just be ready to absorb the punch, it would be ready to deliver a devastating counterblow aimed directly at America's weakest points. The ultimatum that pushed North America to the brink came directly from the White House. Citing Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, President Trump once again invoked the powerful and controversial justification of national security to launch his economic assault. This legal provision, designed for Cold War-era threats, was now being aimed squarely at America's closest and most integrated ally. The White House announced a punishing 35% tariff on all Canadian goods, a move so broad and severe it threatened to grind the $2 billion a day trade relationship to a halt. The official reasoning was a thinly veiled pretext, linking the economic sanctions to unrelated demands on Canadian domestic policy. But the underlying strategy was unmistakable: to use overwhelming economic force to prove that the United States could dictate terms to its neighbors. The goal was to create a crisis so profound that Ottawa would have no choice but to capitulate, not just on trade, but on any issue Washington chose. It was a demonstration of raw power designed to reset the rules of the relationship and reassert American dominance. The Trump administration was gambling that Canada, facing economic annihilation, would ultimately fold, just as it had been perceived to do in the past. They believed the sheer shock and awe of the tariff would force a quick and humiliating surrender. This strategy, known as coercive diplomacy, relies entirely on the target's perception of weakness and their unwillingness to endure pain. The White House calculated that the Canadian economy was too dependent on the U.S. market to risk a full-blown trade war. They saw the deep integration not as a shared strength, but as a Canadian vulnerability to be exploited. The plan was to inflict maximum pain, create chaos in the Canadian market, and then dictate the terms of a new deal from a position of ultimate strength. This approach completely ignored the lessons of the past 4 years and profoundly misjudged the shift in strategic thinking that had taken place in Ottawa. They failed to realize that by branding your closest partner a national security threat, you give them the political cover to take unprecedented actions of their own. Trump and his advisors had set a trap, believing Canada would walk right into it. They had no idea they were the ones about to be ensnared in a crisis of their own making, a perfect storm of economic blowback that would become a case study in boomerang diplomacy. The response from Ottawa was not one of panic, but of chilling, calculated resolve. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his government didn't just respond. They unveiled a pre-prepared, two-stage doomsday plan that stunned Washington and global markets. Plan A was a simple public ultimatum. The United States had until midnight on July 21, 2025, to fully rescind the 35% tariff. There would be no negotiation, no partial measures. It was a complete and total rollback, or Plan B would be triggered. And Plan B was designed not just to retaliate, but to strategically cripple key sectors of the American economy. It was a list of economic weapons aimed with surgical precision at America's most critical dependencies on Canada. First, a 25% tariff on U.S. steel, targeting the industrial heartland. But that was just the opening shot. The core of Plan B was a series of outright export bans. Canada threatened to turn off the lights. A ban on hydroelectricity exports from Ontario to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, and a punitive $7 per megawatt-hour surcharge would immediately cost American energy buyers up to $300,000 a day and threaten the power supply for factories in cities like Buffalo and Syracuse. Next, a complete ban on primary aluminum exports from Quebec, cutting off the lifeblood for American auto and aerospace manufacturing. Then, a ban on softwood lumber exports from British Columbia, a move guaranteed to send the cost of American home construction into the stratosphere. This wasn't a list of retaliatory tariffs on consumer goods. This was a direct assault on the fundamental inputs of American industry. It was a plan designed to shut down American factories, stall American construction, and turn the lights off in American homes. To add a geopolitical sting, Canada announced it was accelerating a shift to settle international trade in euros and Chinese yuan, a direct attack on the supremacy of the US dollar, whose share of global reserves had already hit a 30-year low. This wasn't a trade response, it was economic warfare. The unveiling of Plan B created an immediate and severe crisis for the White House. Trump was reportedly furious, backed into a corner by a response far more extreme than he had ever anticipated. His gamble had backfired disastrously. If he proceeded with his tariffs, he would trigger Canada's doomsday plan, knowingly inflicting massive damage on his own country's economy and facing the wrath of industry leaders and consumers. But if he backed down to the public ultimatum, he would suffer an immense political humiliation, appearing weak and proving that his strongman tactics could be defeated. For Canada, the stakes were equally high. Triggering Plan B would mean severing economic ties that had been built over a century, causing immense disruption and pain at home, even if it hurt the U.S. more. The two nations were now locked in a high-stakes game of chicken, hurtling towards the July 21st deadline. The question was no longer about who would win a trade dispute, but whose leader would be willing to preside over a self-inflicted economic catastrophe. While Canada's tough stance may have been a strategic necessity, the immediate cost to its own people was real and painful. The chilling of the relationship was felt instantly by those whose livelihoods depend on the free flow of people. In the 10 days following the tariff announcement, truck traffic across the vital Ambassador Bridge plunged by 18%. Duty-free shops from Niagara Falls to the Montana border saw sales collapse by nearly 50%. The tourism industry was decimated overnight, with over 320,000 airline seats between the two countries cut for the month of August, and Amtrak forced to slash its popular Toronto-Chicago service, a 76% drop in cross-border travel compared to the previous year created a vacuum in hotels, restaurants, and attractions. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis for thousands of small businesses. On a larger scale, this standoff accelerated a strategic pivot that was already underway. Canada's export dependence on the U.S. had already fallen from 78% to 68% as it aggressively sought new partners. The value of its exports to the EU, Australia, and Japan surged by 42%. While this long-term diversification is a strategic win, the short-term process is disruptive and costly, forcing Canadian businesses to reorient decades of logistical planning. The standoff was forcing Canada to sever its oldest economic bond, a painful but necessary surgery for a country determined to control its own destiny. For the United States, the blowback was not theoretical, it was immediate, widespread, and catastrophic. The auto industry was the first to sound the alarm. Ford projected a staggering $2.5 billion loss on its books for 2025. Stellantis warned that its profits could plummet by 75%. General Motors was forced to halt assembly lines in Mexico and faced shutdowns in Windsor. But the pain quickly spread from the boardroom to the living room. The price of essential materials skyrocketed. Copper hit a record $5.68 a pound. The Midwest aluminum premium, a key cost indicator, surged 161%. Steel prices remained stubbornly high. These costs were passed directly to the American consumer. The sticker price of a mid-size SUV was projected to jump by $7,000. The cost of a new home was forecast to increase by nearly $11,000, a blow that would push 1 in 12 first-time homebuyers out of the market entirely. The San Francisco Federal Reserve issued a stark warning. The tariffs could slash real household income by an average of $320 before the end of the year. From the factories of Detroit and the steel mills of Pennsylvania to the supermarkets of New York, the boomerang had returned with a vengeance. And so, North America stands on a precipice. A relationship once defined by unparalleled cooperation is now a textbook example of mutually assured economic destruction. The United States, in a bid to prove its strength, has been diplomatically outmaneuvered and faces a self-inflicted industrial crisis. Canada, in a fight for its sovereignty, has been forced to deploy an economic doomsday weapon that will cause profound pain on both sides of the border. The world's most successful partnership has been fractured, perhaps irrevocably, replaced by a high-stakes confrontation with no victor, only casualties. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both sides lose trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.